welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. If you are new, welcome to my true crime channel where we discuss wrong-uns of all kinds from all over the world. This is the second half of a two-part case, so if you haven't seen the first half yet, make sure you catch up with that one and then come back here to watch this second part. So far we've heard about an horrific attack on a couple whereby Michael Gregston has been killed in a seemingly random attack and Valerie Story has been left for dead, but somehow against all odds manages to survive. Valerie has identified a man who's been convicted many times of car theft but never convicted of any violence, named James Hanratty, and he is about to stand trial. So the trial takes place on the 22nd of January 1962 in Bedfordshire, and to begin with, the trial focuses in on James's alibi, in which he claims to have been in Liverpool during the time of the attack with 3 friends, but he's unwilling to say who they are as they are fellow criminals, and he doesn't want to implicate them in anything. He says he left the Vienna Hotel at 9:30 a.m. on the 22nd of August. He then went to Lime Street Station in Liverpool to meet a man to dispose of a stolen ring. He had a wash at the station and then left his suitcase in the left luggage office with a man whose hand was, quote, deformed or withered. And the prosecution brought in a man named Peter Stringer who did have an artificial arm, but he claimed to have never met James or seen his suitcase. But in actual fact there was another man who had 2 fingers missing from one hand who did remember seeing James that day and was even able to recall that he had a name that sounded something like Ratty. This man was found by private investigators, but he was never used in trial as a witness, and I don't know why. I'm not sure if that man was found after the trial and maybe that's why he wasn't included. James also claimed that he'd been to a sweet shop in Liverpool and asked for directions, but when police tracked down the lady named Mrs Dinwoodie who worked in the shop, she confirmed she saw James but was adamant that the date she saw him was the 21st. James was in London on the 21st and there was evidence to prove that, so her saying she saw him was useless to the defence because she would not agree that she'd seen him in Liverpool on the day of the murder. There was a lot of evidence proving that James was in London on the 21st, hence why Mrs Dinwoodie's witness statement was not of much use. James had visited a dry cleaner's on the 21st in London, he'd visited his friend on the afternoon, Charles France, and then he'd booked a room at the Vienna Hotel. And granted, there wasn't a lot to prove that James wasn't at the scene of the attack that night, but given how there was no physical evidence to connect James to the murder, his defence team could well have been onto a win here due to reasonable doubt. Until, that is, James, for no apparent reason, changes his alibi partway through the trial. On the 9th of February, James tells his defence team that he told police he was in Liverpool that day because he couldn't be sure he could prove where he actually was, which was not Liverpool, it was Rhyl in Wales. Of course, on this news, his defence now have to quickly put together and present this new alibi for James, which involves getting the details from him and trying to track down any witnesses that may have seen him. James tells them that he visited Rhyl on the evening of the 22nd in order to fence a stolen watch to a criminal contact of his. Fencing is basically passing on stolen goods to someone else who can then sell it on. And James says whilst there he stayed in a B&B near the railway line. And James describes the details of this room he stayed in, which was an attic room. He describes the B&B and is able to, in detail, describe the room itself, which included a green-coloured bathroom. The defence team sends some detectives to Rhyl to look for this B&B and they find it, and the description James gave of the B&B and the room itself with the green bathroom is pretty accurate. Not only this, but the landlady of the B&B, named Grace Jones, said that she remembered someone resembling James Hanratty staying in the hotel the night of the murder. But then later she became more vague and said she couldn't remember exactly which dates James stayed there. So Grace Jones is called to attend trial and is cross-examined by the prosecution, which does not go well. The prosecution pull apart Grace Jones's hotel records. They show how her accounts and bookings and general records are in complete chaos. There's no way of knowing who stayed where or when. Prosecution also bring out witnesses who were at the hotel that night and say that they never saw James there. They say that the hotel was fully booked that night, so James could not have stayed in a room there. The prosecution accused Grace Jones of being an unreliable witness and even claim that she's only said James stayed there to get her B&B some publicity. So basically they tear strips off her and she's virtually in tears by the end. But even if that cross-examination hadn't gone so badly, James changing his alibi partway through the trial did not help at all. He was coming across now as a liar. Next, Valerie, the key witness in this trial, is brought into court on a stretcher and is seated in a wheelchair to give evidence. I should note here that what happened back then was they would try someone for their most serious crime during a particular event. So James was not being tried for the car theft nor the attack on Valerie, because the murder of Michael Gregston was the most serious crime that had taken place that night. It was noted in the trial that Valerie did point James out in the lineup, and a lot of weight was placed in her absolute conviction that James Hanratty was the man who attacked her, even though technically the first man she picked out on the first lineup was an innocent man. And further weight was put on the fact that one of the two men who drove past the Morris Minor that night, John Skillett, did confirm that the man he saw was James Hanratty. But as we know, the other man, Edward Blackhall, did not pick out James. The other man who passed the Morris Minor that night, James Trower, also identified James Hanratty as the driver, and that the driver was wearing a dark jacket and a white shirt, which matched what Valerie said. As you may remember, Valerie said that her attacker was wearing a smart suit that night. And just a few weeks before the attack, James had purchased a dark suit. He collected the suit on the 18th of August and wore it all week, which was the week that the murder took place. The jacket to the suit was never found, but the rest of it was, and it was argued that the jacket was the only part of the suit likely to be bloodstained. James said he'd thrown the jacket away after damaging it during a burglary. Now, as we know, the gun and its bullets was discovered underneath the back seat of a bus, and the prosecution bring Charles France in, the friend of James, who he visited on the 21st, and Charles testifies that James had once told him that the back seat of a bus was a good place to hide something, which, of course, worked in the prosecution's favour. The remaining bits of evidence were used by the prosecution, but were all pretty flimsy. As mentioned previously, the sample on the clothes Valerie was wearing was found to belong to blood group O, which James was, but so were millions of other men. James had never met either of the victims, and he seemingly had no motive whatsoever to do what he did. There were the 2 cartridges found in the Vienna hotel, but there was nothing to say how long those cartridges had been hidden in the chairs. They could have been used before the night of the attack. There was also no evidence that James was a violent man. He had been to prison many times, but never for physically hurting anyone. He did tell police that he'd tried to get himself a gun when he was released from prison, but that was to commit robberies. It doesn't mean he actually got one or that he used it. And of course, James being a car thief meant that he had to have had, at the very least, the most basic knowledge of driving a car. But as we know, the attacker couldn't even start the car unassisted. There was pretty much no forensic evidence, and not all eyewitnesses picked James out. But the fact that James was a convicted criminal who did have 3 eyewitnesses placing him at the scene and a twice-changed alibi all weighed heavily against him. Plus, if you remember, during the night of the attack, the attacker said, "Be careful here, there's roadworks around the corner," but then he claimed not to know the area very well at all. Well, later on it was proven that James had lived in that area with his family when he was younger, so that of course was used by the prosecution too. This trial started on the 22nd of January 1962 and it ended on the 17th of February 1962, and at the time this was recorded as the longest trial on record. And the jury are excused at 11:22 a.m. on the 17th of February to deliberate. They request a transcript of the trial up until that point, but their request is denied. The judge does let them have a list of witnesses and the 136 exhibits in the case. The jury then return again 6 hours later to request that the judge gives them a definition of what reasonable doubt is. If you don't know, reasonable doubt is defined as a doubt especially about the guilt of a criminal defendant that arises or remains upon fair and thorough consideration of the evidence or lack thereof. Then, after 10 hours, the jury return at 9:10 p.m. with their verdict, and it is unanimous. It's a guilty verdict. The judge asks James if he has anything to say, to which he replies, "I'm innocent, my lord, I will appeal." At James's sentencing, the judge, as per tradition, places a black cloth on his head and he sentences James to death by hanging. So James's hanging is set for the 4th of April 1962, and as per his statement to the judge, James and his defence team launch an appeal. They managed to get 90,000 signatures on a petition to prevent James from being hanged, and they present their case to the appeals court. In the early 60s, there was a shift emerging in people believing that death sentences should be abolished, and I think that might be part of the reason they were able to get so many signatures. I think people weren't as comfortable anymore about the idea of capital punishment. James, in prison, tells his dad, "Honestly, Dad, I had nothing to do with it. They set me up." He tells his brother, "I want you to carry on with this. The truth will come out one day." But despite this enormous petition, James's appeal is dismissed on March 9th and his death sentence is upheld. He begs his family to clear his name, even though he knows he's going to die. And on the 4th of April 1962 at 8 a.m, James Hanratty is hanged, aged 25, at Bedford Jail by hangman Harry Allen. He always pleaded his innocence until his final day. James's body was buried inside the grounds of the prison, but 4 years later it was moved to a cemetery in Watford. James was one of the last people in the country to be hanged. The death penalty was abolished in the UK in 1965, and it's said that the questions around James's guilt did contribute to the decision to end capital punishment. James's brother Michael said that James being put to death was like a nightmare. He said, "It's bad enough if you believed he'd done it, but when you believe he didn't do it, that makes it twice as hard." When James was convicted, this caused various people to look at this case and question James's guilt, and whether the prosecution's case was even strong enough for the jury to hand out a guilty verdict. And whilst the trial was ongoing in 1962, it caught the attention of a businessman who thought what was happening to James was completely wrong. This man's name was John Justice. John's partner at the time was Jeremy Fox, who was a legal professional. John couldn't really muster much interest from Jeremy at first, but the more he heard about it, the more he also thought, this man is about to be hanged, and it isn't nailed on that he actually did this. And the pair set out to try to prove James's innocence before he was hanged. And so they set about trying to save James's life, and their first port of call was Peter Alphon, the first suspect in this case who took part in that first identity parade. Peter Alphon was a man who spent the majority of his time alone. He didn't have many, if any, friends, and so the two men thought the best approach was to befriend him and to win his trust. And it worked. Peter would go out for meals with the men and have nights out with them, and over the space of a few months he started to tell them more and more about the A6 murder. In fact, when Peter is with Jeremy, he goes as far as to confess to the murder. He also draws diagrams of how the murder scene looked and knows details of what happened that night. Jeremy and John write everything down and even record telephone conversations with Peter in an attempt to put together enough information to try to get this death sentence quashed or at the very least postponed pending further investigation. When Peter found out that he'd been conned by the two men, he was furious. But then the closer it came to James being hanged, the more strange Peter's actions became. Rather than focusing on being duped by the two men, he was now calling his solicitor and sending him letters telling him that James could not die, someone had to stop his execution, and he even went as far as to say, "If James dies, you die." So that was a change in tone that I don't think anyone was expecting. But to be honest, I don't think Peter was a well man mentally. He did quite a lot of strange things, which you'll find out about. Jeremy and Jean put together a very detailed compilation of information showing why they believed that James should not hang, and they raced it across to the relevant authorities. But as we know, it was too late and James was hanged. But even after he died, Jeremy and Jean continued trying to clear James's name alongside a group of campaigners who named themselves the A6 Defence Committee, and this was partly funded by Jeremy, and of course James's family were also an important part of this committee. And the committee went about collating information, witness statements, and basically anything they could find to try to prove James's innocence. And they found all sorts of things that were relevant to this case. Firstly, the original statement that Valerie made was found by the committee, and for some reason this statement was not referred to or made available at any point during the trial or the appeal. This statement found that Valerie had originally stated that the man who abducted her was in his 30s. In her second statement, she changed this to mid-20s. James was 25, but Peter Alphon was 31. And not only this, by 1968, the committee had found no less than 6 witnesses who were willing to confirm that James had been in Rhyl on the 23rd, the day after the A6 murder. One man in particular, a fairground worker named Terry Evans, said that he let James stay at his house in 1961 because James wanted to fence a stolen watch. And if you remember, James at trial said that he went to Rhyl to fence a stolen watch. And another man, Trevor Dutton, said that on the 23rd of August he was at the bank making a payment, and he had this bank payment stamped with the date on it, so that's how he knew the date. And then very shortly after he left the bank, a man with a Cockney accent wearing a smart suit tried to sell him a watch. So that was some pretty interesting accounts from those eyewitnesses, which were only taken years after James was already dead. And then we come to Peter Alphon, the man who was originally considered to be a suspect, and who Jean and Jeremy actually heard confess to the murder. Well, Peter himself started a sort of campaign to prove that James wasn't the killer, and that he was. He wrote to the newspaper, the Daily Express, in 1962, writing that he thought James was innocent, and that he thought James's name should be cleared. In the same year, he wrote to the then Home Secretary simply saying, "I killed Gregston." Now, as I said at the beginning of this case, Valerie and Michael were having an affair, and Peter said that this was the motive for the murder on the A6. Peter said that he had been paid £5,000 to make sure that this affair between Michael and Valerie came to an end. He then said that a man gave him a gun to assist him in making this happen. And so that night Peter went to work, tracking down the couple and then taking them on this horrific journey down the A6. Peter said that he gave Michael numerous chances to escape and get away, but he said, quote, "Each time the bloody man kept coming back." He said he did not intend to kill anyone, but that the gun was fired by accident. He then took steps to hide the murder weapon, and so he contacted a friend, and you may recognise this friend's name. Charles France, who told the jury that James had told him that it was his practice to hide things that he didn't want found under the back seat of buses. So Peter visited this Charles France after the murder and gave the gun to Charles, who told him that he would hide it for him. And Peter went on to say that Charles hated James because James had been involved with Charles's daughter and he did not approve of it. So according to Peter, Charles hid the gun in the back of the bus and planted 2 gun casings in the Vienna hotel room, and then, as we know, went on to say what he did at trial, which was that James was well known to hide things in backs of buses. And Peter's odd behaviour continues. Not long after James died, Peter actually went in 1962 to James's parents' house. Whilst there, he offered them compensation, so I guess that would be monetary compensation, for their son's death. This horrifies Mary and James Sr. and they kick Peter out of the house. Again, very strange behaviour on Peter's part. And if you're wondering what Charles France was doing during these confessions Peter was making, well, Charles France had actually already passed away 2 weeks before James was executed. Charles had suffered from depression for many years, but around the time of James's case, he tried to take his own life 3 times, and on the 3rd time he succeeded. He wrote several letters before he passed, and one of those was addressed to James Hanratty. This letter was basically telling him how much he hated him, but he never said in that letter that he considered James to be the murderer. So by the time Peter was making his confessions involving Charles France, Charles wasn't around to give his side of what happened. And in 1967, Peter continues with his confessions, going as far as to call a press conference where he tells that story again, that he was paid to end the affair. And in 1969, James's case catches the attention of someone rather well known, the one and only John Lennon. So James's parents had a wealthy friend named John Cunningham who had some good connections, and one of those was John Lennon. And at the time, John and Yoko were involved in various causes such as protesting war, and this case seemed to them to be an injustice against James Hanratty, and they wanted to do something about it. And one of the things they did was to part fund the A6 Defence Committee, which helped no end in allowing the members of that committee to go on as long as they did and do as much work as they did. John and Yoko also made a film to promote the request for further inquiries into this case, and the film was a documentary called Did Britain Murder Hanratty? Although the extent to which John was involved in this film is unclear because he isn't on the credits, so perhaps he just helped fund it, I'm not sure. Anyway, the film was only shown once in London in February 1972. There were other mentions in relation to James on an album of John and Yoko's named Live Jam Sometime in New York City. You can apparently hear Yoko shouting on that album, quote, "Britain, you killed Hanratty, you murderer." And then she calls James's name in the introduction of the song Don't Worry Kayoko. If you are a fan of John and Yoko and you have their albums, let me know if you can hear Yoko shouting James Hanratty's name at the beginning of that song. John and Yoko, of course, knew the power of their celebrity, so they also met with James's parents to be pictured together to really raise awareness of James's case. And, of course, this was John Lennon, so it did. And that was about as far as it went with John and Yoko's involvement with James's case, but it was certainly an interesting bit of information, that's for sure. Anyway, back to Peter Alphon and his confession. Peter maintained his confession until 1971, when he randomly retracted it out of nowhere. He started to tell people it wasn't true, and this plays into the hands of those who believe that Peter was lying all along. They said that Peter was paid to confess by Jeremy Fox and John Justice, who were the ones that befriended him to get the confession, and it was suggested that once Peter got the money from the pair, that's when he retracted his confession. There was really no evidence of this other than one time when Jeremy paid for a hotel stay for Peter on one occasion. And not only this, but Peter wasn't known for wanting or taking money. He was offered money to take part in interviews on TV and he declined to appear on them. The A6 committee ended up with a long list of reasons as to why they believed that Peter was responsible for the murder, and some of these were that Peter actually looked a lot more like the identikit pictures than James did. It was also said that when Peter was under pressure, he would lapse into a Cockney accent, meaning that he too might pronounce think as think. Peter never actually came up with a decent alibi for the day of the murder. In Valerie's original statement, she said that her attacker was in his 30s, but later changed that to mid-20s, and Peter was 31 at the time of the attack. And as we know, Peter had more of a reason to want to commit this crime, if indeed he had been asked to do so, in order to split the couple up. And Peter was also known for being a terrible driver. And most interestingly, a copy of Peter's bank account was retrieved, which showed that Peter received cash payments amounting to £7,569 between October 1961 and June 1962, and Peter could not say where £5,000 worth of those payments came from. Finally, it was decided in 1995 that science had developed sufficiently to warrant testing some of the evidence which had been kept from the original investigation. Exhibit 26, a piece of fabric from Valerie's underwear, is sent for testing. The DNA is extracted, but no profile is found, so it's a dead end, and James's family are no further forward 30 years later. And then, 2 years later in 1997, better DNA techniques have emerged already, so this time 2 samples are tested, Valerie's underwear and the handkerchief that the murder weapon had been wrapped in, because that was found to have mucus on it. And this time some progress is made. Scientists are able to generate profiles both from the handkerchief and the underwear, and they're able to prove that those profiles belong to the same person. So for the first time there is a forensic link between the 2 exhibits. But whilst this was good progress, the DNA profile itself could not be linked to a particular person. And then in 1999, more developments take place. The Criminal Cases Review Commission announced that they'd found sufficient issues with the original investigation to warrant reopening the case, and a new forensic technique was also introduced, named ESDA testing. ESDA tests impressions left by handwriting on paper, so the writing on previous pages are able to be viewed, and that's the best way I can find to describe it, which I'm aware is a pretty crude explanation. And this technique is applied to the notes made during police interviews between senior detectives in charge of the case and James, and those detectives are Robert Aycott and Kenneth Oxford. The reason being is that James always said that what was written down during his interviews is not what he said. James said that statements were added that he never said and things he did say were missing. And the ESDA tests proved that James was telling the truth. Part of the first interview was found to have been rewritten after a second interview had been carried out. It's not known why the officers did this, but it really doesn't matter because they did it, and that looks really bad on the police. People were already suspicious of the detectives in charge of this case anyway, given that statements and evidence were found to be undisclosed, which could have helped James in his defence in 1962. For example, the Morris Minor sightings. Sightings of the Morris Minor were made that night in various places, but the only ones that were presented in court were the ones that suited the narrative that the police were trying to put across, which made James look guilty. Members of the A6 committee said that Detective Aycott wanted James to be the guilty party, and it was a case of bending the evidence to fit James. James's brother Michael said that their father always said that Detective Aycott killed his son. But even after all of this, Valerie, as ever, was in no doubt whatsoever that it was James. She knew it was him, and no amount of investigations were going to change her mind. Valerie said, "I identified the guilty man. I looked in his eyes and he looked in mine. I knew who he was and he knew that I recognised him. I had found the guilty person." But for everyone else, James's guilt was looking more and more questionable. So now that there was a DNA profile of the attacker, the next step was to find out if this profile belonged to James or not. So James's brother Michael and his mother Mary submitted their DNA to be tested against this profile. And the results came back, saying that there was a match. The DNA was 2 million times more likely to be James than any other member of the public. But James's supporters were not happy with this result. They didn't think it was accurate enough, because this wasn't James's DNA they were testing, it was his relatives' DNA. So to settle this once and for all, in a shock move in October 2000, the Crown Prosecution Service gave permission to exhume James to get his DNA and test it, because this really was the only way to be truly sure. And James was exhumed in 2001, his DNA taken and tested, and the results shocked a lot of people. The DNA on the exhibits were hundreds of millions of times more likely to belong to James Hanratty than any other member of the population. The DNA profile of the A6 attacker was James Hanratty. This shocked a lot of people, but it didn't deter James's supporters, as they believed that this still did not conclusively prove James was guilty. They believed that there was a chance that this DNA was planted there by the real perpetrator, or that the items could have been contaminated during decades of storage. It only takes the most minuscule skin cell to contaminate something, and it was said that James's clothes and Valerie's clothes were frequently moved around together. They were taken to and from trial in the same boxes. But the scientists' response to that was, well, if James's DNA did contaminate the sample, then that would mean that there'd be two DNA profiles on the sample, James's and the killer's. But there wasn't. There was only one profile on there. James's profile. And after these results were announced, on the 10th of May 2002, the Court of Appeal dismissed the case to clear James's name. They described it as fanciful, and they decided to uphold the guilty conviction. And Valerie's response to the DNA findings was very much a case of, I know, I've always known who did it, so these findings are nothing new to me. They only further support what I've been telling you for decades. There was, at the time, a lot of reasonable doubt in this case. It pretty much entirely rested on Valerie's witness testimony and the two men who identified James as the driver of the Morris Minor. And there was no forensic evidence back in 1962 that could tie anyone, including James, to the murder. There were so many aspects of this case that made many people feel absolutely positive that James didn't do this, so they were shocked when they saw the DNA results. Valerie always said it was him, and she never ever faltered on that. And let's be clear, she was there. She spent hours with this man. No one could know more than her what happened that night. Do I believe they had enough to convict him in 1962? No, I think it was too flimsy a case to send a man to his death. Do I believe that the conviction should be upheld today, now that we know more? Probably, but that's just my opinion, and there's lots of people who wouldn't agree, and that's fine. As for Peter Alphon, as we know, he retracted his confession in the early 70s, and that's pretty much where his story ends. He died in 2009 after a bad fall at his home. From what I can see, James's family and supporters are still trying to fight to get James's name cleared. The last record I can see of them speaking publicly is in 2016, and they believe that the evidence was too old, too degraded, and possibly contaminated to be considered proof. And they think that there isn't enough strong evidence to uphold the conviction, so they will continue to appeal. James's father never lived long enough to see any of this DNA evidence, so he went to his grave believing that his son was innocent and that this was all a police cover-up. Michael, James's brother, said, "I am convinced 100% that my brother Jimmy didn't do this. The man who done this was a monster, and Jimmy was no monster." Michael Gregston, I think, is the one who gets lost in this case. A father of two young sons died, and yet the focus has always been on James Hanratty and Peter Alphon. Michael Gregston was only a young man himself, and he left behind two boys, and that's absolutely tragic, and it's important that he is remembered alongside Valerie's story. And as for Valerie, as I said at the beginning of this case, she was a very strong woman. She's very much one of those people who, when you read about her, she makes you feel like you should stop worrying about your own minor, insignificant problems, because Valerie went through hell, but she did not allow what happened to her to dictate her future. Remember, she was 22 when this happened, and she was determined to live a life as full as possible. Just 10 months after the attack, Valerie went back to work at the research lab, and she financed both herself and her ageing parents, who kitted out their home to facilitate the additional needs that she now had. Valerie never married, but she kept herself very busy otherwise. She was president of her local women's institute, she was an avid gardener, and was responsible for arranging regular transport for people who were disabled in her local area. Valerie received no financial compensation as a result of what happened, and she did not accept the offer of therapy. She considered therapy to be unhelpful, as she believed it led to an encouragement of blaming others for the bad things that happened to you, rather than just moving forward and getting on with things. But she did say, "I still do not like, right to this day, being in a car or in my kitchen and having anyone come up to the window and tap on it." And I don't know about you, but that statement gave me chills. Valerie refused to stop driving. She got a car which was adapted to her needs, and she continually took driving tests to prove that she could drive safely. No one was taking her freedom from her. Once her parents died, she was determined to maintain as much freedom as possible. Even though she did require carers to help her with the basics, the rest she did herself. Valerie never felt any anger towards James's family for continuing to try to prove his innocence. But she also didn't like that celebrities and other prominent figures got behind his case. She thought it gave the family false hope. As far as she was concerned, she knew James was guilty, so they were never going to get that verdict overturned. Valerie never went a day without thinking about what happened to her. But she said in 2002, "We all get bad days, but you get over it and get on. There is an enormous difference between being alone and being lonely. I am often the first and never the second." Valerie Story died on March 26, 2016, aged 77 years old. And that's it. I hope you found this two-part case interesting. If you did, please leave me a like, comment and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. My Twitter handle is down below in the description box if you'd like to follow me over on there. Have a great day, stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.